Well, thanks so much for joining us. Here, just so you know, here with us is also Felipe de Léon. He's actually leading the whole NDC design and formulation process in Costa Rica, and we're really excited that he can join us today. We've really been designing this whole process together, and he's basically the whole mind behind this. So Felipe, feel free to join in anytime if you want to mention anything else that I'm missing. This webinar is basically to present you how we have designed the participatory scenario guided process to formulate the nationally determined contribution of Costa Rica, which is very much linked to the National Decarbonization Plan. What we would like to do is present you why we think it's necessary to use a different approach than most countries use. We want to present you what the process looks like, and we'd also like to hear from you any tips or analogs from other processes that we could learn from, because this is basically something totally new, and as far as we know, it hasn't been done yet in this way. So there's a lot to learn. And yeah, let's see. So my name is Marieke Veeger. I'm a scenarios and policy researcher for the CCAFS Future Scenarios program. Joost gave a presentation last month about the CCAFS Future Scenarios program, which is basically a global research program of the CGIAR conglomerate, where we support countries on a global level in 7 different regions in their long-term planning for climate change adaptation and mitigation within agriculture and food security. So we've been collaborating together with Costa Rica for a few years now, and this process that we're starting this year is basically we've been implementing an innovation in the methodology, just trying to learn from every year that we work together and trying to use the methodology that we use, improve it every time. Okay. So what we are planning to do in this webinar, we're thinking that it will probably take about an hour. So we want to tell you a bit of, give you a little introduction on the NDC and INDC development process in Costa Rica, just so you have an idea of the context. We also want to tell you a bit about what motivates us to use a different approach to plan for emission reduction. Then we want to present you how we've designed this participatory scenario guided process. And we'd also like to ask you for feedback on the areas that we still don't know enough about. And that's basically it. So we're thinking of maybe 30 minutes of presentation and 30 minutes for questions and your suggestions on how we could improve this, how we've been designing it so far. Okay.
Sorry, just if you could exit the full screen and use the normal window, I think it would be easier for us to see, because the full screen is a little bit squished.
Okay, can you see it better this way?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Carl. Okay, so as always, there's a lot of things that we want to say about this process, and we have a lot of different stakeholders and partners that are joining us in this whole process. And obviously we can't tell you everything, so I've tried to make this presentation as resumed as possible, and I will definitely leave out things that are important. So Felipe is online as well to hop in at any moment when I forgot to mention anything that's important. But just to give you a short introduction, in 2015, Costa Rica presented its intended nationally determined contribution, which then the next year was ratified as her first NDC. And then in 2018, the IPCC published a special report on the 1.5 degrees goal that was necessary, which quickly sets a new benchmark for our ambition for Costa Rica, which was basically to set net neutrality by 2015. And so in 2018, Costa Rica published its national adaptation policy to provide a strategic framework not only for mitigation but also for adaptation, so to complement the mitigation work that was already done within the INDC and the NDC. And in 2019, in 2018, Costa Rica developed her National Decarbonization Plan to make sure that the mitigation goals that were set in the NDC would actually also be implemented in a concrete way together with stakeholders in these different sectors. In 2019, this National Decarbonization Plan was officialized by a presidential decree. So when we think about emission reduction and emission reduction plans, we don't only want to set goals, but we also really want to make sure that these goals are achieved with concrete plans. So Costa Rica has made these different steps to make sure that it will be working both on mitigation and adaptation. So what we I won't go into all the details, but what we basically wanted to tell you is the methodology, tell you a bit more about the methodologies that we used to develop these mitigation goals and also these strategic plans. So the INDC was developed quite quickly with limited data and absolutely no capacity to on a national level to do modeling. So as the Future Scenarios project and here within UCI, we started collaborating with Costa Rica at that moment. Since they had limited data, they needed another methodology to work together with stakeholders within these different sectors to think about the future and to think how much emissions could be reduced. So there was basically a complete reliance on qualitative scenario-based policymaking, and which demonstrated its strengths but also its weaknesses, and it showed that it was a very useful tool to get stakeholders together to think about the future and explore possible challenges and opportunities and to set a mitigation goal. But it also showed that it was necessary to invest in climate change oriented modeling on a national level. In 2018, the decarbonization plan was developed, and at that moment the country already had more capacities to actually do that using data. So this plan was relied heavily on modeling inputs and had limited stakeholder consultations beyond more high-level players. So this process also showed its different strengths and limitations in comparison to the more qualitative approach that we used when we developed the INDC. And then the next step was the development of the National Adaptation Policy, which was very much characterized by a broad stakeholder consultation process, including also this active online comment period. So basically, each of these processes highlighted the different pros and cons of these approaches. And what Felipe and I have been thinking all this time is how can we develop this process to really make sure that both quantitative and qualitative approaches can really be combined and fed in, that they can feed into each other. So that's what we want to present to you today, basically. Okay, so how do we then get from these different strategic plans to this new, more ambitious NDC that Costa Rica is going to present this year? So basically, when you define an NDC in the context of all these different mid to long-term plans, it's very different to do that than when you don't have anything. So you have a lot of different plans that you have to take into account. And the main elements that are set in these strategic plans focus on what we will be doing. But if we look on a global level and what we've been discussing, we really see the need to start to talk about how this will actually happen. and how we will make sure that these emissions will be reduced and what kind of measures will be taken and how we will work together with these stakeholders. So what we believe is that robust decarbonization planning really requires that we integrate both these quantitative methods and qualitative methods through an institutionalized process that we can keep on doing every few years on a long term. And with institutionalized, we mean that on a national level, the country has enough capacity to be able to do this on its own. Okay, so nationally determined contributions, those of you that work in climate change know that these are basically, it's a commitment of each country to show the international community how much emissions they will reduce. And usually what I've been focusing a lot in my research is to understand what kind of guidelines exist for countries to understand how they can actually define this emission reduction goal. And what we see in practice is that there are very little concrete guidelines to actually do that. So a lot of countries are doing something else, are figuring out how to do this in the best way. So it's kind of difficult to be able to compare countries. But what we see in general in the guidelines that do exist is that they suggest quantitative emission abatement calculations. So basically different ways of using models to calculate how much emissions can be reduced, considering the current policies that a country has to reduce emissions. So these calculations are made by a small team of experts and modelers. They're based on very high expertise within the area. They're based on the data and literature that exists on how many emissions can be reduced in each sector. So how many emissions can be reduced within agriculture, within livestock, within energy, within transport, etc. What we see is that apart from this very much expert-based quantitative process, UNFCCC also recommends to have a participatory dialogue process to quote-unquote gain support from affected sectors who will actually implement the NDC. So what they want to say with this is that it's important to include these different stakeholders within the process to make sure that they will actually be on board when they have to change the ways in which they produce within these different sectors. Okay, so this last year there have been, with the international community, there's very much a strong discourse indicating that we need to increase ambition of these NDCs to reduce emissions. So the guidelines that exist and that support countries to raise ambitions, what they basically say is that we need to, countries need to consider the innovations and the new data that exists about emission reduction technologies. So they're very much focused on what's technologically possible and the new information that exists to be able to reduce emissions. They also indicate that every country needs to take stock of recent developments, so updated greenhouse gas emission inventories, different trends that exist within sectors, new technologies that exist, and they also need to consider new policies and measures that a country has defined. And what they also suggested that countries need to take into account the different synergies between sectors to be able to increase emissions in that way. What I've been finding is that these guidelines don't really offer detailed methodological steps that will really exponentially increase ambition. So basically, the methods that they're giving countries to define these emission reduction goals are still the same. The only difference is that they say that, well, you should take into account that there's more information available on how much emissions you can reduce, and possibly countries have defined stronger policies to be able to reduce emissions. But what we feel is that that is not actually enough. Okay, so the alternative that we've been developing as a NDC team within in Costa Rica is that we feel that basically these guidelines do not show countries how you can really reduce uncertainty in long-term planning for emission reduction and adaptation. So what we see in practice is that we feel that countries don't feel comfortable enough to really make serious, ambitious emission reduction commitments when there's still very much uncertainty about what will happen in the future, how much a lot of things that can go wrong, a lot of things that you can plan for beforehand. And so our theory is that if countries don't feel comfortable enough to set ambitious emission reduction goals, then they need stronger tools to be able to work with that uncertainty as to increase their ambition. So our theory is that expert-based quantitative modeling is very important to be able to define the numbers that are behind an emission reduction goal. So you need to know how much emissions you can actually reduce, and you need to do quantitative modeling to be able to define that. But it's not enough. So because everyone that works with modeling knows that a model is a reduced version of reality. So how can you actually consider the complexity of the local situation? And also models are based on what you feed into them. And so they basically model what you ask them to model, but there's a lot of things that we don't know yet. So how can you take that into account? And then in the second place, what we feel is important and what we've been learning from our work within the CCAFS Future Scenarios project and within other literature about anticipatory climate governance is that it's necessary to have collective imaginary process where different stakeholders within society anticipate what the future might look like, anticipate future uncertainties and challenges, identify what are the most vulnerable assumptions, and then in a collective way together actually define backup plans to be able to work with that uncertainty. So we can't totally eliminate uncertainty, but we can find ways to explore that future and to work with it and to make sure that our plans are more robust. What we've also seen in these different processes is that when people collectively actually imagine what those future worlds might look like, they go through a process where it also sets in motion different actions that they will then take to reduce these risks. So those are our most important reasons why we think it's necessary to change the way or to amplify the way in which emission reduction goals are defined. Okay. So I was mentioning in the beginning that there are a lot of different partners that are supporting Costa Rica within this whole process. And what I will do in this presentation is show you the different tools that Costa Rica is using and how they will complement each other. So RAND Corporation works in all over the world. They're based in the United States, and they've developed this tool called assumption-based planning, which is basically a post-planning tool as a strategic planning methodology that was developed by them in the 1990s. It's a tool that can be used. It's basically concentrated on the assumptions that are that fundament a plan, and it's a tool that's used to decrease the risks that are involved of implementing that plan. So what the tool does is that it involves different steps to identify these key assumptions on which the plan is based, and then provides a tool to capture and prioritize the actions that are needed to reduce the likelihood and the impact of the risks. So there are 5 basic steps within assumption-based planning. In the first place, we identify the assumptions on which the plan, in this case, the decarbonization plan, is based on. And then we identify the load-bearing and the most vulnerable assumptions. So what are the main assumptions on which the plan really relies on? And if these, with load-bearing, we mean if these assumptions will change or will fail, then the effectiveness of the plan will seriously be fail as well or be effective. And what we then do is identify signposts, so basically signs that will show us that certain elements of the plan will not work. And then we identify shaping and hedging actions to be able to reduce the risks of these things that might happen that will influence your plan. So I'll tell you a bit more about that. So what are shaping actions? And I'm telling you about this because I'm going to back to these shaping and hedging actions, because it's something we want to identify when we will create the qualitative scenarios that are part of this whole process. So a shaping action is basically an action that an organization can take within the current planning cycle, which is intended to control the vulnerability of a load-bearing assumption. So these shaping actions can be used by the organization to encourage, to prevent the failure of that action, of that vulnerability actually taking place. Shaping actions are really intended to increase the likelihood of a desired outcome. Okay, whereas a hedging action is basically an action that an organization can take within this current planning cycle that's intended to better prepare the organization for this potential failure. So it's basically when a way of when something has already happened, then you can use a hedging action to make sure that that this won't continue to happen and that you won't fail your plan. So Felipe, perhaps you can give, you have a really good example of this to show the difference between a shaping and a hedging action. Would you like to share?
Hey, Marieke. Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
So the example that I tend to use when we go through these lately is first for the identification of assumptions, and then for what a load-bearing assumption is, and then what a critical or what a vulnerable assumption is, and therefore critical. I've started using basically the sun coming up in the morning versus us having a electric train for passenger travel in the greater metropolitan area. Both are assumptions, both are load-bearing, as in the plan would have to be substantially changed if something happened there in one of with either of those assumptions. But only one of those, the train is vulnerable in the time that we have, right, in the analysis horizon to 2050. Now, with those two, with that example, what I say is basically, as far as shaping and hedging actions are quite literally shaping the future that you want, right? So you could talk about having a citizens collective or a citizens group that becomes vocal, and you help them organize and you help them shape that. Or you could have a planning, a bus map, a bus planning process, so that you ensure that the routes of the bus make the best use or maximize the use of the rail infrastructure that you're looking at promoting, so that there is more available people, basically, therefore a better business case for your train. Those are things that now to make versus hedging actions. I think now, in case those assumptions fail, right? So coming back to the example, shaping action is making sure that the bus routes integrate with the train routes in a way that maximizes available capacity for the train. Like shaping action is making sure that even though you're maximizing the use of the train, you are not making the bus transport system dependent of the train. That way you hedge your bets, basically, you hedge your risk, that if for whatever reason the train fails or doesn't come online fast enough or whatever, impact of the future.
Sorry,
Okay.
we're getting some terrible background noise. It's interfering with the voice there.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So basically, what Felipe is saying, that shaping action is something that you can do beforehand to try to prevent something that will happen and that will that will prevent you from reducing emissions in this case, whereas a hedging action is something that you can do at the moment when you find this signpost, this sign that you won't be able to reduce emissions. So it's basically sort of like a backup plan. Whereas a shaping action is something that you could start doing beforehand to try to prevent risks. Okay, so just to go through this quickly, so that you have an idea of how assumption-based planning works. So you have a plan, and this plan is based on certain assumptions about the future. You identify these load-bearing vulnerable assumptions. You identify signposts, signs that show you that your assumptions might change. You define shaping actions, and you can also define hedging actions that will sort of like fix it when an assumption has changed. Okay. So I think the reason why Felipe again thought about collaborating with our more qualitative scenarios approaches is that this very much, the way we look at creating scenarios is very much based on assumptions and very much based on reducing risks. So I'll tell you a bit more about that later on. So basically, what I would like to say with this slide is that robust decision making is very much a quantitative approach. So it's a set of concepts, processes, and enabling tools that use computation and quantitative modeling to yield better decisions under conditions of deep uncertainty. So it uses the different tools, decision analysis, assumption-based planning, and exploratory modeling to test test if strategies are robust enough over a wide possible variety of plausible futures, and then to identify policy relevant scenarios and strategies that will make the policy more robust. So it's very much a quantitative tool based on modeling. Okay. So this is quite an important slide because it really explains to you why we are combining this quantitative robust decision-making tool with qualitative scenarios within this assumption-based planning framework. So as you can see, this robust decision-making generated data and insights can help us define, let me start again. This RDM model and tool can give us a lot of insights to identify how we can reduce risks. But what we still miss is to have this very much this imaginary process together with stakeholders that can also help identify other possible risks that within this team of experts have not been taken into account. So what we want to do is to combine this quantitative tool with a qualitative tool where stakeholders actually identify drivers that have not been considered by experts. And we feel that the modeling work that has been done earlier can also help us define what we still need to explore within these qualitative scenarios. And we feel that these qualitative scenarios can also help us to identify these shaping and hedging actions. So basically the insights and questions that come from this qualitative scenarios approach will then feed back into the different models that we've been using to further explore possible risks for emission reduction, and that way basically making sure that both quantitative and qualitative inputs feed into each other, right? So these different elements would then become inputs for the update of the NDC. Okay, so the process that I'm explaining to you now for the scenario guided process to develop the NDC is it covers the six basic sectors in Costa Rica on which the decarbonization plan is focused. So it focuses on energy, which we mainly refer to electricity, so the generation of energy. How do we generate energy within the country? And how can we reduce emission within that sector? It focuses on sustainable transport and mobility. It focuses on industry and the use of other products. So it focuses on construction. It focuses on refrigeration, as well as a few other elements. The plan also focuses on waste management and tries to promote a circular economy. Obviously, it also focuses on emission reduction within agriculture and livestock. And the last sector is silviculture and other land uses. So basically covering forests and other type of land use. Okay. Okay, so what are the different steps that we're implementing for this NDC formulation process? Last year, the NDC team started their collaboration with these different partners to prepare all the quantitative modeling work that will feed into this process, which is with this process ended the beginning of this year. And last month, we also started the scenario based co-construction or participatory process to support the NDC formulation process, which is what I will be telling you more about in a bit. So both these quantitative and qualitative inputs will then feed into the development of the draft NDC for Costa Rica. This draft NDC will then go through different consultation processes, so stakeholders again can give a broader group of stakeholders can then give their feedback on it. And then it will go through final edits and final improvements of the Council of Ministers, and it will then be formally presented. And the second half of this year, the NDC team will be developing their national ambition cycle proposal, which is based on the methodology that I'm presenting to you now. And by writing up this proposal, we basically want to make sure that other countries can also learn from this process and if needed, implemented in the next year. But also that as a country itself, we can also keep on doing this every few years. And with me, I mean the Ministry of Environment, not necessarily myself. Okay, so I mentioned to you that I would tell you more in detail about our participatory scenario guided process to support this the NDC formulation. So just to clarify, I've been mentioning in the beginning that that the one thing is to formulate an NDC, but another thing is to actually have a concrete plan to be to make sure that you can reduce emissions in each sector. And in Costa Rica, that's the National Decarbonization Plan. So what you will see is that within this process, we are very much working with the measures that the country has in mind at the moment to reduce emissions. So in this way, this participatory process will both feed into the NDC as well as the tweaking and every time improving of the decarbonization plan. So the plan will basically be the same, but we want to make sure that every time we evolve in time, the way we will implement the plan will be tweaked, and in that way we will be able to reduce risks. So what we've been doing, what Costa Rica has been doing in previous steps, is this a cost and benefit analysis, which is based on robust decision making, which is this quantitative tool where at least 1,100 different scenarios can be developed to understand how emissions can be reduced and what are the most effective ways of doing that. On an internal level within the team, they've also identified the most vulnerable assumptions of this plan, and this then based on the modeling work that has been done. A while ago, we had our first introduction workshop for each of the 6 different sectors to explain to stakeholders in each sector how we will be developing the NDC. And we've also asked them to identify possible drivers of change. So we've started thinking about what things might change in the future that would affect the effectiveness of this plan. And what we are now doing as a team is to look at all those different drivers that were identified and categorize them in groups so that we can present these different drivers to them again on a later stage in a virtual way with a survey to be able to validate this list of drivers together with them. And at the end of March, we will have our first workshop, our first scenarios workshop, where we will prioritize all these different drivers that have been identified. We will ask stakeholders to prioritize the most relevant and the most uncertain drivers. And then we will ask them to identify different driver states. So basically, a driver is something that can change the course of action of a certain development. And then when we identify different states of these drivers, then we ask stakeholders to think about in what different ways can this driver take place. And we also want, if we have time, we also want to ask them what might be possible interesting combinations of these drivers that help us explore future uncertainties. So as you can see, this is not only a process where we try to create scenarios, but this is also a process where we do it in a very participatory and capacity building way, so that stakeholders also start considering this uncertainty within their own actions. Okay, so what we then want to do within the NDC team, so what you can see here is that the green elements are internal NDC small team elements of this whole process, whereas the yellow boxes are participatory moments. So what we will do after the first workshop is then, based on all these inputs from stakeholders, where they identified drivers, where they identified the most uncertain and relevant drivers, and even gave us suggestions about interesting combinations, we will then create the structure of 6 different scenarios in each sector that would be interesting for stakeholders to actually develop in detail. So what we want to use to decide what kind of scenarios we will develop is, on the first place, consider what stakeholders have suggested, right? So we want to create scenarios that will explore most uncertain drivers. But we also want to take into account the modeling work that has been done before. So, what are gray areas within our modeling work that we still need more information on, of things that might happen? So these two criteria will help us understand what might be interesting scenarios to explore. And then in the third workshop, we will actually unite again with these different stakeholders in these different sectors, where they will actually then, of these 6 scenarios that we created the structure of, they will then pick 4 scenarios that they want to develop in detail. And with developing in detail, I mean that they actually imagine what that world might look like, and then describe what it looks like, and actually write that down. So the result of that, of the first day of the workshop, is that we have 4 different scenarios for each sector of things that might change within each sector, within the context of each sector. And then on the second day of that workshop, we will then use those scenarios. So stakeholders will then use those scenarios to test their decarbonization plan for each sector. So you should imagine that each sector has defined measures to reduce emissions, and stakeholders will then look at those measures and within the world of their scenario identify if that measure will be able to be implemented, if the measure will be effective. And if it wouldn't be effective, they will then identify what actions could be taken to prevent that from happening, which is a shaping action, or what action might be implemented or take place to fix the scenario, basically to fix that you could actually reduce emissions with that measure. So that is this is basically the process that we have in mind to support this NDC development process and the robust, to be able to robust the NDC, the decarbonization plan. So those of you that were in Joost's webinar a month ago, he told you that this is one of the 2 methods that we use to robust a policy or a plan, a climate change plan, by using different scenarios. So the approach that we will use in this case is basically to look at the decarbonization plan as it is now, develop different scenarios that talk about different contexts, and identify things that might change in that context, and then what they will do is to test that plan in each of the scenarios and identify shaping and hedging actions to be able to robust the plan. And what results from that process is basically a decarbonization plan that is more robust and that has different backup plans to manage the uncertainty that has been identified in the scenarios. Okay, that was a lot of information. Before we open the floor for your advice, and by all means, any comments are welcome. But there are a few things that we would like to ask you, and basically a few questions that we still have and that we're not sure about. So these are things that are just basically gaps in science that we haven't been able to address, or that we're not that sure about. So one of the things that we want to know is it actually feasible to be able to identify these shaping and hedging actions by testing the effectiveness of the decarbonization plan? So what we want to do is create these scenarios, that stakeholders create these scenarios, and then by testing the plan in these different scenarios, that they will then identify what actions should be taken to prevent these risks, right? That's basically, do you think that that's actually possible? And then can stakeholders, this is for people that have created scenarios before, so can stakeholders actually develop scenario narratives in one day and then test the plan and suggest improvements to the plan in the next? This is something that we've done before, but we would like to know your thoughts on that. And then for those of you that have worked with quantitative scenario modeling before, how do you think we can best design this process so that the qualitative scenario modeling feeds into the quantitative scenario development and vice versa? Okay. So I would suggest to open the floor now to you if you have any questions, but also any suggestions in terms of our questions. Are there any, since this has not been done before in this way, are there any analog processes that we could learn from? So processes in other contexts, but with similar characteristics that we could learn from? Or do you have any literature tips that we could take into account when tweaking this the design of this process?
I don't know if anybody wanted to speak up, but I can just give a little bit of a comment. And Marieke and I, obviously, we can, and with everybody here who is involved in this project, we can talk more in the future. But I think that one of the things that I've sort of gravitated towards over the years of working with quantitative and qualitative scenarios is to really understand that the quantitative work is really meant to ask different questions than the quantitative scenarios. So trying to integrate them too much is sometimes a little bit of a hopeless cause, because the methods are just meant for such different things. With the qualitative scenarios, you're asking complex kind of integrated questions, and with the model work, it's much more suited to asking specific questions. So I think seeing the modeling as really supportive of asking specific questions that can then be contextualized by the qualitative scenario work makes the most sense to me, instead of really jamming them together so much that they have to sort of depend on each other. I don't know if that makes sense, but.
Okay. Yes, that does make sense, Joost, because it's not for nothing that we have that we have questions about this in terms of how we can actually integrate them. I can imagine that that they just both have their own role within the process.
Yeah, so if you just look at those models, talk to the modelers and ask them, so look at the qualitative scenarios, get a sense of what kinds of questions, more kind of concrete focused questions that the scenario sets offer that haven't been asked before, and then see whether the models can investigate those questions rather than simulating the entire scenario to just say, okay, we have a sort of like current state situation, or maybe with some trends involved that already taken into account, but what if we change this one thing? What is that going to do to our understanding of the system, rather than implementing the scenarios completely with all these drivers at the same time and then not having any sense of what it means for the model anymore, right?
Yeah. Okay, thanks a lot, Joost. That's really useful. So it's basically about asking, you want to ask different questions. Okay. That's something that we've been considering. So we want to understand what questions are not answered yet within the modeling work, and that stakeholders might explore within the scenarios that they will create.
Yeah, so for instance, an example from our European project, Transmongo, where we worked with IASA and the GloBiome model. There, one of the key interests in coming from our qualitative scenarios was more localized economies, and that was something that GloBiome normally didn't do. But the modelers went out and extended the model so that was a possibility to investigate. And so the only thing they changed is make certain aspects of the economic modeling more localized, and then just see what happens. And we wrote an entire paper about just that one question, but it was a question that came from the qualitative scenarios. So that translation, I think, is much more useful than having these sort of like homogeneous blobs coming out of the model that sort of look like this, that are sort of like a weird version of the scenarios without capturing the full complexity of what's going on in the narratives.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks a lot, Joost. Any other questions or suggestions? Feel free to indicate that you want to make a comment.
Yes, again, you can click on the hand button on the bottom left to note that you want to make a comment.
Okay, so Felipe just indicated that he has to go now, but I'm taking notes of all your comments and we'll discuss them with him afterwards. Thanks a lot, Felipe, for joining us. So apart from suggestions, you can also just ask questions about this process.
Yeah, I will just keep asking questions until somebody else speaks up, if that's okay, because I actually have a lot of questions. So just briefly, or maybe a suggestion or a sort of remark, I'm very, very interested in how this project combines more sort of plausibility related scenarios with the sort of more prediction or a probability likelihood type approach of the RAND kind of setup. I think that's quite interesting. I mean, there's a lot of theoretical sort of differences there that are being mashed together, but that's not necessarily bad. Carlijn, who is now in another meeting in Oxford, but she's written a paper about how these two approaches represent fundamentally different modes of engaging with the future. The first one having this idea of reducing uncertainties, and the second one, the sort of more multi-scenarios approach, is much more about navigating irreducible uncertainty, right? And in this case, you're sort of like taking those two theoretical perspectives and letting them speak to each other. And I'm not so sure if that of the theoretical basis for that is completely realized in the project yet, but it's definitely something to investigate, right? That sort of like broader exploration of futures combined with this sort of like risk reduction approach. Because I also think that the sort of RAND model of sort of these load-bearing assumptions could also be completely translated to a more plausibility-based approach. Because still, you know, without the sort of kind of risk reduction, you could still think about these sort of assumptions, which assumptions are the most load-bearing. And I think that's a very useful sort of like mode of critique of what people are planning. So that's cool to see. But there's a lot to unpack there, I think.
Yeah, I think there is, and just as you say, this has also been really interesting for me to be observing in this whole process and understanding RAND's work, because I indeed feel that they're really sort of like closing the gap between this very much predictability focus, and because it is definitely about risk reduction. But on the other hand, it is very much exploring possible futures. And so it is very much about plausibility, basically saying, well, we can run any scenario possible and just basically see what happens when that scenario takes place. So I think it's a very interesting way of combining these two streams, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, any other questions, comments?
Brendan, you had a question or comment?
Yeah, I was just going to say quickly along kind of the same lines there. I'm not sure how married this process is to using the RAND approach explicitly, or if it can take into consideration kind of other perspectives from similar process design exercises. But I know that the literature for decision making under deep uncertainty is kind of getting at some of the same tactics. So mapping out different risk factors and taking into account scenario pathways, kind of looking at adaptive policy planning. So that might be another perspective to consider.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Brendan. So what I understand is that decision making under deep uncertainty is very much also RAND's approach, and yes, we are very much open to different approaches, and I think that's the reason why Felipe asked for our support, because he very much saw the opportunity increasing the quality of the process by also using a more qualitative approach to basically just to complement this whole quantitative robust decision making process. Yeah.
Great.
Anna Sophia, you go ahead,
No,
Brendan.
sorry. I was just going to say that I wasn't aware how RAND and DMDU overlap, but yeah, I think you're right. They probably do quite a bit.
Yeah. Thanks, Brendan. Anna Sophia, you also want to make a comment?
Just quickly that I think Robert Lampert, who is he used to be the chair of the Deep Uncertainty group, is actually at RAND. So.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Okay.
Hi, my name is Anna Sophia, and I just have a quick question about the process with the stakeholders. How is because it's a different methodology, I think, for people in Costa Rica. So I'm just curious, how was that taken by a broader stakeholder? I'm not sure how much policy is involved, but I'm curious to know about the buy-in and how involved they are in the process.
Okay, that's a really good question, Anna Sophia. I've always been really impressed with how how Costa Rica works with how they look at policy making, because as long as I've been working with them, there's always at least since since 2015 when we started working together, they have always made it very, very clear that they want to involve stakeholders right from the beginning in this whole thinking process about emission reduction. And not only mitigation, but actually also very much adaptation. So what I've seen is that basically leaders within each sector, so very much influence stakeholders that have a lot of influence within each sector, are invited and involved in all in different steps of this decarbonization process. Very much in a way of working together in it. So what I see from the climate change department is that they basically meet up with stakeholders and present them. So this is what on an international level they are asking us to do. This is how we are thinking of doing it. What do you guys think? What things haven't we taken into account? What things should we change or adjust? And in these first workshops that we had a few weeks ago, there were so much very, very relevant comments that stakeholders made. So certain drivers that they mentioned that the expert group didn't take into account yet, basically because they're the ones that really have the knowledge on what's happening on a local scale, right? So I feel that they very much been involving stakeholders right from the beginning. So these scenario workshops that are coming up they definitely won't be the first time that stakeholders are asked about their opinion. They're already used to that. And you can tell that they've very much been within that whole process, been trained in thinking about the future. But as you also know, developing scenarios is always a challenging thing, and there will probably be stakeholders that haven't done that before. So what's important is that you really guide them through that process and make them understand why we're thinking about the future, and how we can do that. So that's what we'll be doing in those workshops.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions?
Oh, maybe just a quick question to follow up. You've worked with other countries in Central America. Do you find there's a difference with like this process with the stakeholders? Is it different or is it similar?
Let's see. I feel that stakeholders in other countries in Central America are also very much interested in in thinking along with the government on how to plan processes. And I feel that also in other countries, stakeholders also really feel that they have that right. The difference that I see is that when it comes to this whole NDC process, which I personally haven't gone through in other countries, I can really tell that in Costa Rica, stakeholders are very much used to thinking along with the government. And so maybe that's a difference that I see, but I can't really compare it to other countries because I haven't worked with them within this whole decarbonization process. But what I see that they have in common is that stakeholders very much know what's going on, and they are really the best source to understand what risks might take place and what we could do to prevent them.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Any other questions before we close up? Okay. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time. I hope this has been a learning experience for you as it also is for us. Thank you for all your suggestions. We will definitely take them to account, and I will meet up with Felipe afterwards to make sure that he got those last recommendations that you gave us. This recording will be posted online, so you can always look at it afterwards or share with other colleagues that you think that might be interested. And take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.